My name is Ken Love, and on the 6th of September, I was on a Zoom call with Climate Action for Lifelong Learning. At the end of the call, we spoke for a while, and we got talking about the clean electricity regs. I said I would provide some information, and it ended up being a slide deck. I'm going to use it. I used it for other things as well since then, but I've decided to put a voiceover to it and send it to you folks. So here's my contact information, and much of the work that I do on climate change issues is done through Climate Messengers Canada. We're just a group of all volunteer people who organize on Slack and put things out over social media, and that's our website at the bottom. The goal of this presentation is to show you how to make submissions to Environment and Climate Change Canada's online public consultation on the draft CERs that were released in August, to give you some information about the federal draft CERs, and to explain why it's so very important for climate concerned individuals and groups such as CALL to make submissions to this consultation. Because we need to counter the forces of some politicians and the oil and gas lobby. I want to quickly put the draft clean electricity regs in the context of other climate issues that are going on right now. One thing that I always like to keep in mind is a pie chart of where Canada's GHGs come from. Now you can see here oil and gas and electricity. Now this is 2019 numbers because that was the last year before COVID skewed and I would say artificially decreased Canada's GHGs, but only temporarily. You can see that 26% of Canada's emissions come from the production of oil and gas. Now that's just the production, not the burning of it. Whereas only 8% come from generating electricity. So I would respectfully suggest that climate activists should spend a lot more time and effort on reducing the GHGs from oil and gas production than on electricity. We're going to have an opportunity to do that because they're going to bring out regulations capping and cutting emissions from oil and gas production. But that's going to happen not until at least several weeks from now. So now it's a good time to focus on the draft clean electricity regs. Context is also important if you just consider Ontario's sources of GHG emissions. You can see that 2% comes from electricity generation and that 24% of Ontario's emissions come from buildings. So sometime soon we should put relatively more time and effort onto reducing emissions from buildings in Ontario. And the main way to do that might well be to seek amendments to the Ontario Building Code that requires the use of heat pumps or sets particularly low emissions per square meter of a building. However, like I said a moment ago, now is probably a good time to focus on the clean electricity regs. With that context, let's deal with the easy part first, and that's how to make submissions to the online public consultation. You go to that website, and I'm going to send the PowerPoint slides to you folks along with this video. So if you have the PowerPoint slides, you can just click on it. Or you can simply do a Google search and type in Canada Gazette Part 1 Clean Electricity Regulations. That will take you here. You can see that ECCC's online public consultation is open until November the 2nd, 2023. If you scroll down a little bit further, you'll see the document you're looking at is called a Regulatory Impact Analysis Statement, or RIAS. Every time draft regs are published in Canada Gazette Part 1, there's also a RIAS. And it contains a description of what the draft regs do. And at the same time the RIAS is published, a text of the proposed draft legal text of the actual regulations is published. Now there's a lot of important and useful information in the RIAS, but sometimes they can be beastly difficult to read. I would suggest you have a look at it, read as much or as little as you want, but that'll give you an idea of the process. You make your submissions by clicking certain boxes right within the online version of the RIAS. So you click there, add comment for the general comment section. That'll open up this box where you can type in 20,000 characters, which is a fair bit. If you scroll down through the RIAS, you can see that there are a number of other boxes, typically under specific headings, and you can type more specific comments into these boxes as well. I think most of them give you an additional 20,000 characters. I find it's a good idea to type out your comments beforehand using something like Microsoft Word or Google Docs. Then you can go over them and make them just the way you want. Then you can copy and paste them into the box or multiple boxes on the RIAS form. Here you can see that I just typed in something to make it work. I typed "this submission says nothing" and I'm only doing it to show how this works. Once you click out of that, it'll say please go to the bottom of the page when you are ready to submit all your comments, and you just click there. There, when it's time for you to submit your comments, it'll ask you to review them, and it'll ask you to complete some contact information, including your name. However, it's important to know that neither your name nor your contact information is ever made public. And then you simply submit your comments. That's all you need to know to make comments. Before we get into a consideration of the substance of what you might want to comment on, we can just set a spell and look at the view. Okay, let's get into the substance. To understand the clean electricity regs, and really to understand how Canada deals with all emissions from industrial sources, you need to understand the concept of emissions intensity. First, in terms of measuring GHG emissions, you need to know that GHG emissions are expressed in carbon dioxide equivalent, or CO2 equivalent units. Some GHGs, like methane for example, are more damaging than CO2, but CO2 is the most prevalent of all GHG emissions. So all the other gases are calculated back to the amount of CO2 equivalent that they are equal to. Hence, emissions are expressed as CO2e. The most useful unit to measure the CO2e will vary on what the circumstances are. Sometimes it's grams, sometimes it's kilograms, often it's tons, occasionally kilotons, and annually we talk about, for entire countries, they're measured in megatons. So a megaton is 1 million tons of CO2e. Emissions intensity is simply the amount of CO2e that is emitted to produce some unit of a certain product. I personally find that pictures help. So here's emissions intensity in action. Here you got the Acme Widget Corporation. And here you see that it just produced one widget. That's a real widget too. You can look it up online. And in producing that one widget, the Acme Widget Corporation emitted 30 grams of CO2 equivalent GHGs. So a widget from the Acme Widget Corporation has an emissions intensity of 30 grams of CO2e per widget. Like I just said, the emissions intensity of an Acme Widget Corporation widget is 30 grams of CO2e per widget. But the Better Widget Corporation uses a cleaner practice, and it only emits 20 grams of CO2 equivalent to create the same widget. Therefore, we say that it has a lower emissions intensity than an Acme Widget Corporation's widget. Just so you know, although those are real widgets, we have no idea what the emissions intensity of these widgets are or of any other widgets. Now, the unit of measurement for electricity under the clean electricity regs, and indeed for electricity generated at a provincial or national level, is tons of CO2 equivalent per gigawatt hour. We'll get there like this. That's what a ton of CO2 looks like. Somebody used this display at one of the latest conferences of the parties or COPs sometime in the last few years. A kilowatt hour is a stream of 1,000 watts of electricity that flows constantly for 1 hour. We don't have a picture of a kilowatt hour of electricity, but you probably pay for several of them each month on your hydro bill. Also, if you're reading this or listening to this on your computer, you're using some small fraction of a kilowatt hour of electricity to do so. Now we just have to take that 1 kilowatt hour and see how many of them it takes to have a gigawatt hour. 1 gigawatt is 1,000,000 kilowatts. So 1 gigawatt hour equals 1,000,000 kilowatt hours that flows constantly for 1 hour. There you go, 1 GWH. So the emissions intensity for electricity generation on the provincial and national level is expressed in tons of CO2 equivalent per 1 gigawatt hour of electricity. And the unit is there, TCO2E per gigawatt hour. Congratulations, you know all you need to know about emissions intensity for electricity generation. The rest of the conversation is all about how many tons of CO2e can or cannot be emitted to produce 1 gigawatt hour of electricity. The only other part of the conversation is how many tons of CO2e electricity producers get to emit for free per gigawatt hour of electricity produced before they have to pay the carbon tax. To understand the clean electricity regs, we need to know the status quo in Canada before the introduction of this clean electricity regs. There's a maximum emissions intensity for producing electricity, and producing electricity at an emissions intensity higher than that may attract fines or even jail for the producer. There's a carbon tax on GHGs emitted from producing electricity. An electricity producer can emit a certain number of tons per gigawatt hour for free and must pay the carbon tax on the number of tons emitted above that amount. The federal government sets national rules about these things. And at least on the carbon tax part of it, provinces can set their own rules as long as they are generally as or more stringent than what's called the federal backstop. In terms of the maximum emissions intensity permitted, the federal government sets this under CEPA. The longer name for a CEPA is the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, and it regulates a lot of stuff. But one of the things it does is set that maximum limit for the emissions intensity of electrical production. And the rule is you can't emit more than 420 megatons of CO2 from your gas plant for every gigawatt hour of electricity you produce. If you're found guilty of emitting more than that, you can be fined or sent to jail. There's the rule in all its legalese glory. I kind of find it interesting, but I don't expect many other people do, and that's fine. Put another way then, under CEPA, if this gas plant generates 1 gigawatt hour of electricity, and in doing so it emits 419 tons of CO2, that's okay. But if in generating that 1 gigawatt hour of electricity, That gas plant emits 421 tons of CO2. That's not okay. Somebody's going to be liable to punishment. Like I said, that punishment could be a fine or jail. And because of that, it's an exercise of the criminal law power. And the Constitution says that the federal government has exclusive jurisdiction over the exercise of the criminal law power. So because of that, the Supreme Court says that using CEPA in this way is a valid exercise of the federal government's power, and therefore it's constitutional. CEPA is constitutional. So that's the rule about the maximum permitted emissions intensity. The other thing to look at is the carbon tax, and I put it in quotation marks because it's not really a tax. The way it applies to consumers using things like gasoline or gas for your home, as you know, we get checks from the government to give most of that money back. It works in a similar fashion on the industrial side so that it's not a tax. It was brought in under what's called the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act. That's the last time I'm going to say that. It's the GGPPA. And it's part 2, which is the output-based pricing system, and that's the OBPS. That's the part that applies to industrial emitters. It puts a charge on the GHG emissions that industrial emitters emit. For consumers, it's the fuel that we use, and they calculate how much burning that fuel generates in GHGs. But for industrial emitters, it's the amount of GHGs that go up the smokestack. And the charge is the carbon tax per ton of CO2 equivalent GHGs. But the industrial emitters only pay on some of their emissions under the OBPS, or some of the emissions that go up their smokestacks. Under the federal OBPS, gas plants that began operating before 1 January 2021 are permitted to emit 370 tons of CO2 equivalent GHGs without paying any carbon tax on those emissions. They only pay the carbon tax on emissions above that amount. The average gas plant in Ontario has an emissions intensity of 415 tons of CO2 equivalent per gigawatt hour. So, put another way, under the OBPS, the factory owner pays the carbon tax on the emissions per ton of CO2 equivalent emissions, but only on some of those emissions. The gas plant generates 1 gigawatt hour of electricity, and in doing so, emits a total of 415 tons of CO2e. The gas plant operator gets to emit 370 tons of that for free. And he only pays the carbon tax on the amount over and above that, which is for each gigawatt hour, 45 tons of CO2e. The federal OBPS doesn't apply in Ontario. Provinces can create and use their own system of GHG taxation as long as their system is generally as or more stringent than the OBPS. That's called the federal backstop. Since the 1st of January 2022, an Ontario provincial scheme has been used. It initially set the emissions intensity for electricity generation at the same 370 tons CO2e per gigawatt hour. But since the 1st of January 2023, Ontario's emissions intensity has been reduced to 310 tons per gigawatt hour. So, put another way, for each gigawatt hour of electricity that the gas plant generates, the operator gets to emit 310 tons for free, and he only has to pay on the difference, which in this case is 105 tons per gigawatt hour. The carbon tax goes up every year and will go up to $170 per ton by 2030 if the government keeps its promise and if there's another government elected before then they don't nix the system. The Ontario system is the same in terms of the putting it up price per ton per year, and it'll go up to 170 by 2030. So now that we know the background before the draft CERs, we can see what the draft clean electricity regs do. They're being made as regulations under CEPA. That means that they're made under the federal government's criminal law powers, and they will almost certainly be held to be constitutional. Perhaps the first thing to know about them is they set a very low emissions intensity standard. Beginning on the 1st of January 2035, gas plants commissioned on or after the 1st of January 2025 cannot emit more than 30 tons of CO2 per gigawatt hour as an average over a calendar year. By using a higher than zero emissions intensity, the government is trying to be technology neutral. So electricity will still be able to be generated by gas plants, but they're going to have to capture a lot of their emissions. In fact, the 30 megatons is only about 5 to 10% of what the emissions actually are. So they're going to require carbon capture technology that captures 90 to 95% of their emissions. Perhaps the next thing to know about the draft clean electricity regs is they don't kick in for gas plants commissioned after the 1st of January 2025 until 2035. And there are no interim restrictions, but maybe that's not a problem. Gas plants typically operate for at least 40 years from their commissioning date. They typically don't make money for the first 10 years, so it takes more than 10 years before they break even from their construction and startup costs and start being profitable. The government believes that because of this, no new gas plants will be built without carbon capture and storage. The government states that the 10-year window before they kick in will give gas plants time to work out the problems with the new carbon capture storage technology. Existing units are treated differently under the draft clean electricity regs. An existing unit is defined as a facility, for our conversation, a gas plant, that was commissioned before the 1st of January 2025. The 30-ton CO2 per gigawatt hour restriction does not apply to these existing units until the end of their prescribed life. And that end of prescribed life is defined as the later of the 1st of January 2035 or 20 years after the existing unit's commissioning date. And like I said, that's the definition of end of prescribed life. Now that's not terrific, especially for Ontario. And you'll see later in this presentation that some the NGOs identify this as something that people should complain about to the government during this consultation. However, and you can decide for yourself, perhaps it's reasonable considering that these are national regulations, and Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Nova Scotia, also New Brunswick, rely very heavily on gas plants right now. And they built these gas plants because they're just finishing off their reliance on coal plants. Apparently not too many new plants will be commissioned between now and the 1st of January 2025. And 20-year end of prescribed life is a reasonably favorable compromise, considering, as we said, that gas plants can operate generally for a total of 40 years. It does mean that a new gas plant that's commissioned in 2024 can operate unabated until the end of 2044. Again, though, the government believes that not many new plants will be built between now and 2025. You can decide for yourself whether you think this is a reasonable compromise or whether you think it's something that the government should make more stringent. There are some assorted exceptions to these rules. For example, gas plants can operate unabated for a limited number of hours per year as emergency backup. Some of the ENGOs have put out material that deals with this, and you're welcome to look at it. In fact, I encourage you to, and form your own opinions. Now we can turn to thinking about what people might want to say in their own submissions. First and foremost, use your own words. Even if several people want to make the same basic submission, it is very important to change the wording so that each is unique. Each unique submission must be considered individually by ECCC. Identical submissions simply get lumped together and treated, to my mind, as little more than one data point. Several weeks after the public consultation on these draft regs close, you'll be able to see the submissions that have been made without the names of the individuals who made them in Canada Gazette 1 online. As an example, right now you can go and see the submissions that were made on the draft zero emissions vehicle regulations and the importance of using one's own words. You can see how many people are making the same general argument, but they're each using their own words. Whereas when some people, maybe clicked on a form email or something like that, you can see it's there once and then it says this submission was made 372 times or whatever it was. Second, and I mean this with great respect and all sincerity, we really don't care exactly what you say. And in fact, we want you to think about it and make your own submissions. We believe that sincere, thoughtful climate activists should form and express their own ideas. We don't believe that there's one and only one true answer. We're quite confident that with relatively small variations, the general trend of the voices of all climate-concerned individuals will push in the same direction. And those variations are very, very important to the process. Third, make your submission personal. Tell them why you are concerned about climate change and why this climate change policy is important to you. Only as examples, here's some of the things that we in the climate messengers might address in our own submissions. Again, we really hope that you'll form your own opinion and make your own submissions in your own words. An excellent way to do that is to see what other ENGOs are saying. So here's what the David Suzuki Foundation states verbatim in the form email that they're encouraging people to send. As I've said, we believe that a climate-concerned individual or small grassroots group can make a much stronger impact by making a unique individual submission rather than using a form email with identical wording for everyone who uses it. Each unique submission must be considered individually, whereas submissions by way of form emails are probably treated as little more than one data point. Having said that, the points that the David Suzuki Foundation makes certainly have merit, and they deserve consideration. You can find them at this website. Another point that you might well want to address is the fact that under the Federal Output-Based System, the OBPS, as well as under the applicable Ontario provincial system, the carbon tax is not applied to enough of a gas plant's GHG emissions. You saw that with the pictures above. Well, this might otherwise be outside the scope of the clean electricity regs. When ECCC recently considered revisions to the output-based pricing system, those revisions generally made the emissions intensity rules more stringent for most industrial activities. However, ECCC said that the OBPS review was not going to deal with the carbon tax on electricity, including from gas plants, because that was going to be done under the clean electricity regs. Apparently, however, it wasn't done there. I try very hard not to give people information and say something, oh, just trust me. I like to provide the source. So here's the source of what I just said about how ECCC said the treatment of electricity generation in the OBPS is not being considered in this review. ECCC will consider revisions to the treatment of electricity generation under the OBPS as part of the process to introduce a clean electricity standard. And that's the hyperlink to the document where that was stated. Now, a moment ago, I gave you a link to what the David Suzuki Foundation is saying about the draft clean electricity regs. Here's a hyperlink to what Environmental Defense is saying about them. Here's the link to the report that the Ontario Clean Air Alliance put out on the draft clean electricity regs on the 26th of September. I dare say that perhaps the most important thing I hope to have provided you with in this video is just an understanding of how emissions intensity works, particularly with electricity generation. Now that you know that, all of these reports, I think, are much easier to read. And I really hope you will read as many of them as you can. Here's one report about the clean electricity regs that I really, really hope you will read. It's from the Canadian Climate Institute, and it's very clear and relatively concise. You can find it at that hyperlink, or you can just Google Canadian Climate Institute and look for what they say about the clean electricity regs. If you have the time and the inclination, I hope you'll look up more information for yourselves to put in your own submission. To my mind, the goal is to make them as useful and as unique as possible. Here are a couple of sources of information, not on specific issues in the clean electricity regs, but information that can help support your points, and particularly the importance of simply making the clean electricity regs. Here's a link to a paper put out in February of 2023 by Clean Energy Canada. It says phasing out gas plants by 2030 is feasible in Alberta and Ontario. In Alberta and Ontario, wind can now produce electricity at lower cost than natural gas-fired power, even with more cost reductions on the horizon. Even when the costs of battery storage are included, both wind and solar are cost competitive in many scenarios. This report was put out today on the 26th of September by the IEA, and the point it makes, it looks at a roadmap or a pathway to keep us under 1.5 degrees Celsius in warming. And it says that electricity sectors in advanced economies in aggregate must reach net zero emissions by 2035 in the net zero scenario. So there were some sources on what you might want to comment on by way of specifics for the clean electricity regs, and also some sources for why it's important and why it can be done. But regardless of the content of your submissions, the most important reason for you to make those submissions is to counterbalance the opposition. For over a year now, Environment Canada and the federal government have been lobbied ferociously, almost every day, by the oil and gas lobby, both on this and on the proposed cap on emissions from oil and gas production, to, in this case, delay these regulations or to water them down, and ideally from CAP's point of view to not bring them in at all. Similar pressure is being put in by groups like, or companies like Enbridge, who pipe the gas to the gas plants. But in this article that came out the day after the draft regs were unofficially introduced, CAP says, CAP is concerned that the proposal as currently drafted will limit the ability to use natural gas. Canada produces some of the world's lowest emitting natural gas and is a critical part of our country's energy security. We are also concerned that the proposal will have investment impacts. CAP intends to actively participate in the consultation to address the concern on behalf of our members. That is why you need to make your submissions. But it's not only the oil and gas lobby. The federal government is facing incredible pressure from certain politicians. Here's one from the National Post. Alberta will never comply with federal clean power grid plan, Premier vows. The text of the article says Alberta will never comply with a federal government plan to phase out carbon emissions from power generation by 2035, Premier Danielle Smith said. We will never allow these regulations to be implemented here. Full stop, she said. If it comes down to it, we are going to do our own thing. We have to. A few days after, according to this CBC article, Premier Scott Moe of Saskatchewan said the federal government's proposed clean electricity regs are quote unquote unachievable for the province and would quote at least double the power rates unquote, although experts dispute those claims. So I would respectfully suggest that the thing for you folks to do is to review what you know about the draft clean electricity regs, to discuss with your colleagues how the draft clean electricity regs should be improved, and then to make your submissions, both individually and perhaps, I hope, on behalf of CALL, before 11:59 p.m. on the 2nd of November. Here are a few of the hyperlinks. The others are farther up in this presentation. That's it. Thanks very much for watching this and considering these issues. If you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to contact me. My email and my cell phone number are in the top one of the early slides. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.